Hey, what's up, everybody? Grace Community Church fam. So good to be here. I'm Corey. I'm here with Pastor Bill. And I just want to first, before we jump into this cool kind of live Q&A time, I want to acknowledge and celebrate the 12 salvation hand raises that we saw today during the
Nice.
11:30 service. Just want to praise God for that, for you, for the commitment you made. And if you want to engage in live prayer, if you want to talk with someone, or maybe you have some questions, we would love to engage with you. Our prayer team is standing by. But we're going to go now live to just some questions, some conversation about today's message, and really about QuaranTeam in general, because we've been in this series for 4 weeks talking about love and agape, unconditional love. So if you've got questions, type them up, drop them in the chat, and we will try our best to get to all of them. And if you don't ask questions, then we're just going to talk, and you might get bored. So without further ado, Pastor Bill, you want to say hey, introduce yourself, and tell the people who you are?
Hey, what's up, everybody? Yeah, my name is Bill, and I get to work with all of our lead pastors at our different campuses here at the church. Also want to say happy Mother's Day to all the mothers, the moms, and the moms at heart out there. So thankful for you. And yeah, I'm glad to be on here. If you hear screaming in the background, my 22-month-old son just woke up from a nap, and he is not happy about it. That's all I'll say.
He's got some feelings about quarantine.
He's got some feelings, yeah.
Same. All right. Well, I'll jump in. I see some, lots of people saying hey and what's up. So thanks for tuning in. We'll jump off with the first question. The first one I saw, and I just want to kind of acknowledge it. We probably won't spend too much time. Oh, and also shout out to my mom. Just text me. She's watching live. So shout out to my mom. Happy Mother's Day, Mom.
Oh, shout out. Happy Mother's Day, Corey's mom.
But yeah, the first question I saw is from Michael B. And Bill, if you kind of want to take this question, it's how do you come from the place of loving and enduring to downright abuse? Physical is so obvious. What about emotional? And what do you do with that?
So if I just taking a little bit of a jump here at some assumptions, you're saying like, how do you go, where do you go when you've been loving, you've been enduring, and then how do you know when that has transitioned into a point of emotional abuse? And you're saying physical abuse is obvious, like that's much easier to identify. How do you identify emotional abuse? I definitely think that's, first off, let me say I'm not a trained counselor, so I don't feel qualified to get into defining all of that. However, this is what I would say. If at any point you are wondering or you're asking that question for yourself, I think you could definitely reach out to our team. We have a spiritual care team that is fantastic. They can help walk you through some conversations around that, help you kind of process what you've been going through. But that's the best thing to do. I don't think there's really a good answer that I can give that's going to be broadly applicable. Not to mention the fact I don't feel particularly qualified to do that. But does that kind of make sense to you, Corey?
Yeah, that's, if I had gotten the question, that would have been probably my response as well. When I read that question, I thought there's definitely room for more conversation, but definitely in a one-on-one kind of spiritual care kind of way. So if that's you, or if you're identifying with that in the chat, we would love, again, click prayer, and we'll try and get you connected to one of our spiritual care people, even if it's another conversation later this week. If you are, if you're going through stuff and you've got questions specifically related to abuse in all forms, we would love to walk alongside you and kind of in a more one-on-one way.
Absolutely.
So next question is from Jenna. Thanks for your question, Jenna. The question is, how do you have lower irritability with your QuaranTeam and have more patience? So,
okay. I really like this question, and I'll tell you why. For one, I don't know if this is why you're laughing, Corey, but I get irritated very easily by silly little things, probably more so than big things. So I'm a person that gets irritated easily, and I would argue probably my family would categorize me as generally impatient. So this is a good question for me because I wrestle with and deal with the consequences of this regularly. For one, my first thought just immediately goes to, well, why are you irritable and impatient? You know, I don't think that's like a personality thing. There's probably something that underneath of that. So for the most part, when my behavior is crossing a line or causing issues with other people, the first place that I try to look at is what in my life is underneath of that. It's kind of like being sick, and you have the root cause of the sickness, and then you have the symptom. You know, you have a fever.
Yep.
Fever is not a sickness. It's a response to something deeper going on in your body. So I'm irritable. I'm impatient. Well, irritability, if I just focus on my irritability and patience, I'm not going to get very far with that. But if I start digging down and asking myself, okay, well, let me step back for a moment. Why am I so irritable? Why did this little thing, why did somebody, you know, spilling some milk upset me so greatly? Why? Okay, is it a lack of sleep? Am I under some other tremendous stress? And it's not always going to be something that you can fix or change, you know, and certainly that's like the whole point of this series that we're in, QuaranTeam, is you really can't change or alter a lot of the environmental circumstances that you're in right now. Right. But if you name it and you own it, and then I think take some responsibility for it, I think that's helpful. Give permission to people around you to call you out on it. Now, I know that can be dangerous, but you know, for me, if there was a pattern of irritability and impatience, I would say to my wife, like, please point that out to me.
Yeah.
And she would not fight me on that request. But then I have to be committed, you know, again.
Yeah. Committed to hearing well. I think that's a whole piece of this, is being able to approach those very difficult, sometimes like painful conversations with humility. Pastor Jared talked about that, I think, week 2, humility and self-awareness. I think as it relates to not being irritable and building in some extra patience, it's mostly like what you were describing. I don't think I can get irritable. I'm not an irritable person, maybe. But digging down and being willing to acknowledge what's at the bottom of it, where it's coming from, I think that's such a huge piece. And I imagine for people who are tuning in, like, that's what they're living with right now. It's like, oh, there's this deep thing I'm dealing with that makes me so irritable.
And your expectations could be a huge part of that. For me, I can tell you a lot of my irritability and my impatience comes from oftentimes just having outsized or unrealistic expectations on myself and on other people. So if it's on myself and I'm failing to meet that expectation, that irritability and impatience can be expressed toward other people in my household, even though I'm not irritated with them or impatient with them, I'm with myself. But in the same token, if my expectations are too high, and I know it does sound silly, and I think somebody on the earlier Q&A was joking around about it, but to a certain extent, you know, having reasonable expectations is a good way to manage that.
Yeah.
You know, if I'm constantly getting irritated because something in the house is the wrong, I mean, maybe I just need to accept that it's going to be like that for a little while, you know?
Yeah, no, it's good. Just kind of owning that. We got a question here from one Ben Kennan, so just a little shout out to Ben, because it's your brother, but I'll let you dog on him in a minute. But the question is, how do you determine people that are good in your life? So this is kind of a follow-up question. How do you determine the people that are in your life who are good to give that permission to call you out? Like, how do you identify those people, especially if you're not married, or you're not like kind of stuck in with a certain group? Like, how do you find those people and bring them in?
Yeah, I think so. First off, it's got to be somebody that knows you reasonably well. It just can't be any old person. Sometimes good friends can be the wrong person for that, because they want to be your friend. If they're a great friend and a person that you've really truly given that kind of permission to speak into your life in that way, then that can be good. But it's got to be somebody, and then it's got to be somebody that you're going to choose to trust. So I know we talk about earning trust, we talk about giving trust, but as a person who is giving somebody permission to call them out on something or to speak into something, you have to give the trust in them to be able to say that. If that person is not somebody that you trust and you're not going to choose to trust what they're saying, then it's not going to be very helpful, because every time they call you out, you're just going to go, no, I'm not, that's not what's going on. So I think that, I think that's important. And the reason I'm specifically not saying choose somebody that you trust is that I know that a lot of times in the house, we struggle with trust issues. And I don't mean trust like infidelity type things. I just mean trusting a person's perspective, trusting that they have your best interests at heart.
Trusting their motives even.
Exactly. Yes. Maybe more so than anything else, motives.
No, especially in quarantine, those are all like, to me, even in our life and in our marriage, my wife next door, you'll probably hear her banging on the wall. Like, that's us. Cause it's, there's so much that relates to expectation, then to boundaries, and then to trust and motivation. It all on its own, each of those things and all of these layers are uniquely difficult and large, like, issues. But then when you're confined to your house, when you're together all the time, they sort of just, it seems like they all just kind of loom larger. So I don't know, for whatever reason, the first few weeks of this, for us especially, we felt that pressure to, like, it just was almost seemed unmanageable. What would you say? Because I'm sure there are still people in those shoes. And this is kind of my own question, because I talked myself into one, so now I get to ask a question. But what would you say to people who are struggling with the pressure and the weight of those things? Like, how would you coach them if they're struggling with self-awareness, humility, patience, and endurance? Like, how, especially as it relates to the four walls of your quarantine, how would you coach people through some of that weight?
Okay, so I hope this is not equal parts overly practical and completely abstract, but I'm a huge fan of this concept of like owning your situation and not blaming others for it. And I want to be clear, I'm not talking about it like if someone is abusing you physically, emotionally, however, like, you need to talk to one of our care team and walk through that. But generally speaking, when we're just talking about trying to get along, I think it's almost never a one-sided thing. There's always two parts to it. And so I just like saying, hey, figure out your part of it and don't worry about the other person. So for me, I'm struggling with my self-awareness. I'm struggling with my patience. I'm struggling with my teachability. That's a big thing. If you're not teachable, if two unteachable people are stuck together in close confined quarters, then you're going to be really miserable, because you both need to learn and you need to learn from each other. So it's almost going to this Proverbs type of iron sharpening iron type of mentality of like, I'm going to allow the circumstances to hone me into a more godly character. But that's a painful process. So for me, what would I do? I struggle to take space to think and be quiet and sit. I don't know who said it, but I read it, and my wife sends it to me regularly as a reminder. But something like half the world's problems and 90% of the world's wars could have been avoided if people just knew how to sit quietly by themselves and with their thoughts. And I think that's a huge thing. In the most stressful times where I have felt that there is no space for me to do anything, I just simply have to get up earlier in the morning. Now, for me, that's what works. And it's painful because oftentimes I'm in this stressful situation that's impacting my sleep and it's impacting everything else. And yet I go, okay, well, I'm going to just sacrifice the extra half hour or however long I need to get up. My very unhappy son is in the background.
I can hear him.
But I'm just going to do that so that I can have some time quietly to sit with my thoughts before the Lord, to invite the Holy Spirit into that process. And I know that sounds like stupidly practical, but that's probably one thing that we can all do. We can all find 30 minutes to do less scrolling, less TV watching, less snacking, and take that time.
I feel so called out right now.
Shift it to me too. Shift it to the beginning of your day or at a point that makes sense for you, and just get quiet, because my self-awareness, silence and solitude is maybe like the water on the tree of self-awareness for me. That's a weird analogy, but the point is, like, for me, it doesn't happen if I'm not taking that time. And so even if you're like, well, I'm a single parent, or I'm here, and where am I going to get that time? And that's why I'm saying it's really difficult.
Yep.
You may have to do it like in the middle of the night. But there's always probably some space that we can etch out in there to do that.
Yeah, it is really difficult to do that work, like to make space for some of that, like just deep work or deep like reflection. But it's equally as much work, I think, and probably more, to try and keep up with all the things that are driving you nuts anyway. Like to not do that, you're spending that energy just somewhere else. It's getting spent, it's getting used, and it ends up with a more detrimental effect in my mind. It becomes a more detrimental thing. So I have that time, but I have it late at night, like after the kids are asleep. Mm-hmm. And that's like just my time to like reflect on the day, prepare my mind for the next day, like run through my schedule, even just like nail down those things. It's like it fits into everybody's rhythm, but I make the time, like I sleep 15 minutes less so that I can have that space. Because if I don't, then I'll wake up the next day and I'll be a monster. It's that kind of, everybody can make some space or time for something. And it is overly practical, sure, but I think we all need that. And it's a great reminder for everyone.
Yeah. Can I throw something else in there too? I would highly recommend, this is what I do when I'm at my most desperate. And the reality is, for each of us, we are probably a much larger part of the problem than we acknowledge and give credit to. I'm not talking about situations of abuse, but like you yourself personally are. Maybe the most valuable thing that you can do is to just refuse to think of how this applies to somebody else in your life and just leave them out. Unless it's a matter of like the endurance piece. If you're like, okay, I'm going to endure this, but the more you can do that, and the more you can say, the only thing I can control really is my own actions and my own response. So I'm going to build these intentional acts into my life, and then I'm going to do those with no expectation for how the other person is going to respond. Because many times the error we make is, I'm going to do all these things. I'm going to get up. I'm being more self-aware. I'm being kind. And then the other person doesn't respond the way that we want. And what happens is we actually never dealt with the resentment and the upset and all that. We just put a dam up, and then we dynamite that thing in that moment, and it all comes rushing out. And then you're angry because they didn't respond the way you thought they should respond. And maybe I'm just solely talking about myself here, but I think, so don't do that with an expectation. And you say, I'm going to use every difficult thing here and allow that to shape my character. But that is a mindset of like just incredibly high owning of your own role in things, and saying, God, I want you to work in my heart. But the moment that you try to become God's instrument in the life of somebody else's life in an intentional way, that's like flying a kite in a thunderstorm. I don't know what I'm saying right now.
Everyone's getting to experience the on-the-spot Bill analogy that I have gotten to work with for several.
Incredibly mediocre on the spot analogy.
They're never knock it out of the park, but they're never terrible either.
You'll never write it down in your notepad, but it will
adequate
in the moment. Yes.
But no, I think that's such a good point. Because I saw in the chat, I saw Shaq was like, somebody in the chat was like, hey, can we make sure we acknowledge that this is not just for us, it's for other people? And I'm like, yes, it absolutely. This message of like all of this whole series for QuaranTeam, it's for more than just us. But you and I don't take on that role of hammering this truth into someone else's brain. That's that's the Holy Spirit's work. That conviction, that like that light shining in places. That's our job as Christ followers. Is to be in relationship with those people, not to slap them with the truth of these things. That's why we say we love you enough.
Yes,
tell the truth.
I know we're almost out of time, but one thought I was just going to say is I think just look at the model that Jesus painted for us. Mm-hmm. Jesus did not come in power and domineering and shouting and screaming. He came in weakness. He came in serving, and then he died on the cross. So I think that type of self-sacrificial love, to me, I can always go back to that. And I don't have that in and of myself of my own strength, but I know through the Holy Spirit's work in my life that is accessible to me.
And right on cue.
There you go. I'm coming.
No,
Just like
that's excellent. We're almost out of time anyway. So thank you for that, Pastor Bill. A lot of people in the chat saying thank you. Somebody, your brother, asked if we could have a quick argument about flat bill versus curved hats. I feel like we'll table that for another day.
I just literally grabbed the first hat I could find because he was in my rooms.
All right.
Garage.
If you have thoughts, you can always post them on our Facebook. Tell us what you think is better. But all right. Thanks so much, everyone, for tuning in, for making time for this. We love you. We will see you next week. And again, happy Mother's Day to all the moms, specifically my mom, if you're still watching. Love you, Mom.
All right.